Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight we continue our Greek mythology series with the 12 labors of Heracles, a hero's redemption, the 9th chapter in our journey. A demigod's strength meets a goddess's wrath as Heracles battles for atonement through trials that shake the heavens. If you haven't subscribed to Sleep Stories TV, join us now. Hit that bell and let no tale pass you by. Now settle in and let's step into the myth where courage rises and redemption begins. Among the demigods, none was born with greater strength, and none had to bear a greater hatred from a god than Heracles, the son of Zeus. His birth was a spark that ignited divine wrath, a tale woven with celestial intrigue and mortal frailty. Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans would later call him, entered the world not in the golden halls of Olympus, but in the humble city of Thebes. His father Zeus, king of the gods, had fallen in love with Alcmene, a mortal woman of unmatched beauty and virtue. Disguised as her husband, Amphitryon, Zeus lay with her, and from that union Heracles was conceived a child of divine blood, destined for greatness, yet cursed by the jealousy of a goddess. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the heavens, could not abide this affront. Her husband's infidelity was a wound to her pride, but the child it produced, a half-mortal heir to Zeus's power, was an insult she could not forgive. From the moment Heracles drew his first breath, Hera's enmity shadowed him, a relentless storm cloud over his life. Even as an infant, Heracles' strength was prodigious, a sign of his divine heritage. In his cradle, barely days old, he faced his first trial. Hera, in her malice, sent 2 serpents to strangle the child as he slept. Their scales glinted in the moonlight, their fangs poised to end the life of Zeus's son before it could begin. But Heracles, even then, was no ordinary babe. His tiny hands gripped the serpents, and with a strength that belied his age, he crushed them, their lifeless bodies falling limp to the floor. Alcmene and Amphitryon, awakened by the commotion, stood in awe of their child's power, but also in fear for what kind of life awaited a boy marked by such divine favor and divine hatred. This early victory only deepened Hera's resolve. If serpents could not kill him, she would find other ways to torment him, to break him, to ensure that Zeus's beloved son would know no peace. As Heracles grew, so did his legend. His strength was unmatched, his courage boundless. He was a man of towering frame with muscles like forged iron and eyes that burned with an unyielding fire. He trained under the finest teachers. Amphitryon taught him to drive a chariot. Autolycus schooled him in wrestling, and Eurytus, a master archer, honed his skill with the bow. Yet for all his prowess, Heracles was not immune to the frailties of the human heart. He loved deeply, married Megara, the daughter of King Creon of Thebes, and fathered children who filled his life with joy. But Hera's hatred was a patient predator biding its time. She watched as Heracles built a life, as he laughed with his family, as he basked in the adulation of those who saw him as a hero. And in her cold, divine heart, she devised a punishment far crueler than death, a torment that would strike at the very core of his humanity. Hera's wrath was not content with mere physical trials. She sought to wound Heracles where he was most vulnerable, his soul. Her power reached into the mortal world, twisting the threads of fate to her will. She waited until Heracles was at the height of his happiness, surrounded by the love of his wife and children, before unleashing her curse. It was a subtle, insidious thing, a whisper of madness that crept into his mind, clouding his thoughts, distorting his reality. In that moment, Heracles was no longer the hero, no longer the loving father or devoted husband. He was a puppet dancing on Hera's strings, his strength turned against those he cherished most. The tragedy that followed would haunt him for the rest of his days, a wound that no strength could heal, a burden that no courage could lighten. It was this act born of divine malice that would set him on the path of the 12 labors, a path of suffering redemption, and ultimately apotheosis. Heracles' birth and early life, marked by both divine favor and divine vengeance, were but the prelude to a saga of unparalleled heroism. The enmity of Hera, a goddess whose power was matched only by her spite, shaped his destiny from the cradle. Each step he took, each feat he accomplished, was shadowed by her relentless pursuit of his ruin. Yet it was this very struggle that forged him into the greatest of heroes, a man whose name would echo through the ages. As we turn to the next chapter of his tale, we find Heracles not at the height of his glory, but in the depths of despair, his hands stained with a crime so horrific that it threatened to shatter his very soul. The path to redemption would be long and arduous, a journey that would test the limits of his strength, his will, and his humanity. But Heracles' greatest tragedy came not from an external enemy, but from a fit of madness sent by Hera herself, causing him to murder his own wife and children in a delusional rage. The hero whose strength could topple mountains and whose courage could defy monsters was brought low not by a foe's blade, but by the cruel machinations of a goddess. Hera, ever watchful, ever vengeful, had bided her time waiting for the moment when Heracles' happiness was at its peak. He had found love with Megara, the gentle and wise daughter of King Creon, and their home in Thebes was filled with the laughter of their children. Heracles, for all his divine blood, cherished these mortal joys, the warmth of his wife's embrace, the bright eyes of his sons and daughters, the quiet moments of peace that made his heroic deeds worthwhile. But Hera, whose heart burned with an unrelenting hatred for Zeus's son, saw in this happiness an opportunity to strike. She wove a spell of madness, a dark veil that descended upon Heracles' mind, twisting his perceptions, clouding his reason, and turning his love into a weapon of destruction. In the quiet of a starlit night, the madness took hold. Heracles, the protector, the hero, became a stranger to himself. His eyes, once warm with affection, blazed with a fevered light. His hands, which had cradled his children, now gripped them with a terrifying strength. In his delusion, he saw not his beloved family, but monstrous threats, enemies conjured by Hera's cruel magic. The halls of his home, once filled with laughter, echoed with screams as he struck down Megara and their children, one by one, their blood staining the floors he had walked as a husband and father. The act was swift, brutal, and irrevocable. When the madness lifted as suddenly as it had come, Heracles awoke to a nightmare. The bodies of his loved ones lay before him, their lifeless eyes staring in silent accusation. His hands, still trembling from the violence, were slick with their blood. A cry tore from his throat, a sound of such anguish that it seemed to shake the very heavens. He fell to his knees, his mighty frame racked with sobs, his heart shattered by the realization of what he had done. The weight of his crime was unbearable. Heracles, who had slain serpents as an infant and faced countless dangers without fear, now faced a foe he could not fight his own guilt. The people of Thebes, who had once hailed him as their champion, turned away in horror. Whispers followed him not of his strength or heroism, but of the monster he had become. He could not stay in the city where his family's blood stained the earth. Driven by grief and shame, Heracles wandered a broken man, seeking some way to atone for the unforgivable. His steps led him to the sacred sanctuary of Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo, the Pythia, spoke with the voice of the gods. In the dim, incense-filled chamber, he knelt before her, his voice hoarse with despair, begging for a path to redemption. The oracle's words were both a lifeline and a curse to cleanse his soul. He must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae. A man as petty as Heracles was great for 12 years. He would undertake any task the king demanded, no matter how impossible, no matter how degrading. Only through this servitude, through suffering and sacrifice, could he hope to wash away the stain of his sin. The oracle's pronouncement was a bitter pill. Eurystheus, a cowardly ruler who hid behind his throne, was no match for Heracles in strength or valor, yet he held the hero's fate in his hands. Hera's influence lingered in this judgment, for Eurystheus was her chosen instrument, a man whose jealousy and spite would ensure that Heracles' trials were as humiliating as they were perilous. Yet Heracles accepted his fate without protest. His guilt was a chain heavier than any forged by mortal hands, and he would bear any burden to free himself from it. He left Delphi with a resolve born of desperation, his heart still bleeding from the loss of his family, but his spirit unbroken. The labors that awaited him would test not only his strength, but his will to endure, to rise above the tragedy that defined him. As he set out for Mycenae, the shadow of Hera's wrath still loomed, but so too did the faint hope of redemption, a hope that would drive him through trials that no mortal could survive. This moment of tragedy, this descent into madness and despair, was the crucible in which Heracles' legend was forged. The loss of his family was not merely a punishment, but the catalyst for his greatest journey. The labors that lay ahead, imposed by a spiteful king under the influence of a vengeful goddess, would push him to the limits of human endurance and beyond. As we turn to the next chapter of his saga, we find Heracles standing before Eurystheus, his head bowed not in defeat, but in determination, ready to face the tasks that would define his path to atonement. In the depths of his despair, Heracles sought out the oracle at Delphi and received a judgment: he must serve the cowardly king Eurystheus for 12 years and complete any task the king demanded. The weight of his crime, killing his beloved wife Megara and their children in a fit of Hera-induced madness, had driven him from Thebes, a city that could no longer bear to look upon its fallen hero. His heart was a storm of grief and guilt, his once invincible spirit battered by the knowledge that his own hands had wrought such devastation. Yet even in his darkest hour, Heracles clung to a flicker of hope, a desperate need to atone for the unforgivable. The road to Delphi was long, winding through rugged hills and shadowed valleys, each step a reminder of the life he had lost. The sanctuary itself was a place of awe, its marble columns gleaming under the sun, its air thick with the scent of burning laurel and the whispers of the divine. Heracles, a giant among men, knelt before the Pythia, the oracle of Apollo, his broad shoulders hunched under the burden of his shame. His voice, rough with sorrow, pleaded for a path to redemption, for some way to cleanse the blood from his hands and the stain from his soul. The Pythia, her eyes glazed with divine vision, spoke words that cut like a blade. To purify himself, Heracles must submit to King Eurystheus of Mycenae, a man whose name was synonymous with weakness and envy. For 12 years he would be bound to this king's service, undertaking any task, no matter how perilous or degrading, that Eurystheus might devise. The oracle's decree was not merely a punishment, but a divine mandate, a crucible through which Heracles could forge a new destiny. Yet the choice of Eurystheus as his master was no accident. Hera, the goddess, whose hatred had orchestrated Heracles' tragedy, had chosen Eurystheus as her instrument, a petty ruler whose cowardice and spite would ensure that the hero's trials were as humiliating as they were dangerous. Eurystheus, born to the house of Perseus, was a distant cousin to Heracles, but where Heracles was bold and mighty, Eurystheus was small-minded and fearful, hiding behind his throne in the fortified halls of Mycenae. The contrast between the two men was stark. Heracles, the son of Zeus, a demigod of unparalleled strength; Eurystheus, a mortal king who ruled through manipulation and malice, his authority bolstered by Hera's favor. Heracles accepted the oracle's judgment without protest, though the thought of serving such a man must have galled him. His pride, once as unyielding as his strength, was now tempered by guilt. He knew that redemption would come at a cost, and he was prepared to pay it, no matter how steep. Leaving Delphi, he journeyed to Mycenae, his steps heavy but resolute. The city's high walls loomed before him, a fortress built by the Cyclopes, its stones a testament to a power older than man. Eurystheus, seated on his throne, regarded Heracles with a mixture of fear and disdain. The king's eyes gleamed with the opportunity to humble the hero, to reduce the son of Zeus to a mere servant. Yet even in his submission, Heracles' presence filled the room, his towering frame and piercing gaze a silent challenge to Eurystheus' authority. The tasks that awaited him, soon to be known as the 12 labors, were not mere adventures, but a divine sentence, each one designed to test the limits of his body, mind, and spirit. They were a path to atonement, a way to reclaim his honor, but also a gauntlet thrown down by Hera, who watched from Olympus, eager to see him fail. The labors would not be simple feats of strength, though Heracles' power was legendary. They would demand cunning endurance and a willingness to endure humiliation. Eurystheus, guided by Hera's whispers, crafted each task to exploit Heracles' vulnerabilities, to break his spirit where his body could not be broken. The hero stood before the king, his head bowed not in defeat, but in acceptance, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The oracle's words echoed in his mind: 12 years, 12 tasks, a chance to wash away the blood of his family and restore his place among the living. As he awaited Eurystheus' first command, Heracles could not have known the full scope of the trials that awaited him. Monsters, gods, and journeys to the edge of the world. Yet in that moment, he was driven by a singular purpose: to prove himself worthy of forgiveness, to silence the screams that haunted his dreams. The path of the labors was set, and with it the next chapter of his saga would begin, one that would pit his divine strength against creatures of nightmare and tasks of impossible odds. This decree from Delphi marked the turning point in Heracles' life, transforming his grief into a quest that would echo through the ages. The 12 labors were not just a punishment, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even one touched by divine blood. As we move forward, we see Heracles facing his first trials, battles against monsters that seemed invincible, demanding a strength that transcended mortality itself. His first tasks were to face seemingly invincible monsters, trials that demanded a strength far beyond that of a mortal man. King Eurystheus, guided by Hera's spiteful hand, designed these labors to break Heracles, to pit him against creatures so fearsome that even the gods whispered their names with dread. The hero stood before the king in Mycenae's great hall, his massive frame a silent rebuke to Eurystheus's cowardice, as the first labor was declared: to slay the Nemean Lion, a beast with a hide impervious to mortal weapons. This was no ordinary creature, born of the monstrous Typhon and Echidna, its golden fur gleaming like armor, its claws sharper than any sword forged by man. The lion terrorized the hills of Nemea, its roars shaking the earth, its appetite sated only by the flesh of those foolish enough to cross its path. Heracles set out with his bow, his quiver of arrows, and a club carved from an olive tree, his heart heavy with the weight of his past, but steeled by the promise of redemption. The journey to Nemea was one of solitude, the rugged landscape mirroring the desolation within him, each step a reminder of the family he had lost and the atonement he sought. When Heracles reached the lion's lair, a cave with 2 gaping mouths, he found the beast waiting, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. He loosed arrow after arrow, but the shafts bounced harmlessly off the lion's hide, splintering against its unbreakable skin. His spear thrust with all his might, bent as if striking stone. Undaunted, Heracles cast aside his weapons, trusting in the divine strength coursing through his veins. He charged into the cave, blocking one entrance with boulders to trap the beast. The lion lunged, its jaws snapping, but Heracles grappled it with his bare hands, his muscles straining as he wrapped his arms around its neck. The struggle was titanic, man against monster, the cave echoing with roars and the crack of bone. Heracles tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the lion's throat, until at last the beast's strength failed and it fell lifeless to the ground. Victorious, Heracles skinned the lion with its own claws, the only thing sharp enough to pierce its hide, and donned the pelt as a cloak, its head a fearsome helm. He returned to Mycenae, the lion's skin draped over his shoulders, a symbol of his triumph. Eurystheus, trembling at the sight of the hero in the beast's hide, forbade him from entering the city, ordering him to display his trophies outside the walls. The king's fear was palpable, but so was his malice, for he immediately devised the next labor, one even more daunting. The second task was to slay the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent-like monster lurking in the swamps of Lerna, its 9 heads hissing with venom that could kill with a single drop. This creature, another spawn of Typhon and Echidna, was sacred to Hera, who had raised it to be Heracles' doom. Its central head was said to be immortal, and for every head severed, 2 more would grow back, a nightmare of regeneration that mocked mortal efforts. Heracles, undeterred, enlisted his nephew Iolaus to aid him, a rare moment of companionship in his solitary quest. They approached the Hydra's lair, a foul mire, where the air was thick with the stench of decay. Heracles drew the beast out with flaming arrows, its heads writhing like a storm of serpents. He waded into the swamp, his club swinging, and began to hack at the Hydra's necks. But as each head fell, 2 more sprouted, their fangs dripping with poison. Realizing brute force alone would not suffice, Heracles called to Iolaus for aid. The young man lit a torch, and as Heracles severed each head, Iolaus cauterized the stumps with fire, preventing their regrowth. Together they felled the mortal heads until only the immortal one remained. With a mighty blow, Heracles buried it beneath a massive rock, sealing its threat forever. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's venomous blood, turning them into weapons of deadly power, and returned to Eurystheus, who seethed at his success, but refused to acknowledge the labor, claiming Iolaus's help violated the terms. These first labors showcased Heracles' divine strength, a power that could wrestle monsters to submission and overcome impossible odds. Yet they were only the beginning, a prelude to the trials that would test not just his physical might, but his endurance, ingenuity, and spirit. Eurystheus, emboldened by Hera's whispers, sought new ways to challenge the hero, tasks that would demand more than muscle. As Heracles stood ready for the next labor, his lion-skin cloak a testament to his victories, he braced himself for challenges that would require not only strength, but a persistence that could outlast the gods themselves. It was not only strength, but also extraordinary persistence and speed that Heracles had to prove in seemingly endless pursuits. Having vanquished the Nemean Lion and the Lernaean Hydra, Heracles had shown the world his unmatched might, but King Eurystheus, spurred by Hera's unrelenting malice, sought to test the hero's endurance in ways that brute force alone could not overcome. The next labors demanded a relentless spirit, a heart that could chase fleeting goals across vast distances and through impossible odds, all while maintaining a discipline that tempered his divine power. The third labor was to capture the Lernaean Hind, a sacred creature of Artemis, with golden antlers that gleamed like the sun and hooves swifter than the wind. This deer, radiant and elusive, roamed the hills of Lernaea, a creature so swift that no mortal could hope to catch it, and so sacred that harming it would invoke the wrath of a goddess. Eurystheus, in his cunning, knew this task would push Heracles to the limits of his patience, for the hind could not be killed or wounded, only captured alive, a feat that seemed to mock the hero's strength. Heracles set out under a sky streaked with dawn, his lion-skin cloak heavy on his shoulders, his mind fixed on the challenge ahead. The Lernaean hind was no ordinary beast. It was a creature of divine grace, its golden antlers catching the light as it bounded across meadows and forests. For a full year, Heracles pursued it, his steps tireless, his eyes never wavering from its fleeting form. Through rugged mountains and dense woodlands, across rivers and plains, he chased the hind, its speed a taunt to his mortal limitations. He could not use his arrows, for Artemis's wrath would be swift, nor could he rely on traps, for the hind's instincts were sharper than any snare. Instead, he relied on his stamina, his legs carrying him day after day, night after night, through blistering heat and biting cold. His body, though divine in strength, ached with the strain of the endless hunt, yet his will remained unbroken. At last, in a moment of cunning, he cornered the hind in a narrow valley where its speed could not save it. With gentle hands, he pinned it to the ground, careful not to harm its sacred form, and carried it back to Mycenae. Eurystheus, expecting failure, could only scowl as Heracles presented the living, hind its golden antlers a testament to his perseverance. But the king, ever eager to diminish the hero, ordered the hind released back to Artemis, denying Heracles even the satisfaction of keeping his prize. The fifth labor for Eurystheus, in his spite, skipped the fourth for now, was to drive away the Stymphalian birds, monstrous creatures that plagued the lake of Stymphalos. These were no ordinary birds, but man-eating beasts with feathers of bronze that could pierce armor claws like daggers and beaks that tore flesh as easily as they tore through the air. Their flocks darkened the skies, their screeches a cacophony that struck terror into the hearts of men. The lake, surrounded by dense marshes, was a fortress of mud and reeds, making approach nearly impossible. Eurystheus believed this task would overwhelm Heracles, for how could one man drive away an army of such creatures? Heracles, undaunted, approached the lake under a moonless night, the air thick with the stench of decay and the rustle of metallic feathers. His strength alone could not scatter the birds, for their numbers were too great and their flight too swift. But Heracles was not merely a warrior of muscle. His mind was as sharp as his arrows. Athena, taking pity on the hero, gifted him a pair of bronze castanets forged by Hephaestus, their sound a piercing clang that could shake the heavens. Standing at the edge of the marsh, Heracles struck the castanets together, the sound reverberating across the lake like a thunderclap. The birds, startled from their perches, rose in a chaotic storm of bronze and feathers, their screeches drowned by the relentless clanging. Heracles seized the moment, firing his venom-tipped arrows into the flock, not to kill, but to drive them into the sky. The survivors fled their wings, beating a frantic retreat, never to return to Stymphalos. The lake, once a place of terror, fell silent, its waters reflecting the stars once more. Heracles returned to Mycenae, his task complete. But Eurystheus, ever resentful, dismissed the victory, claiming the aid of Athena diminished the hero's achievement. Yet Heracles stood tall, his resolve unshaken, for he knew each labor brought him closer to redemption, each trial a step toward cleansing the blood from his hands. These labors of endurance revealed a new facet of Heracles' heroism, not just the strength to slay monsters, but the tenacity to pursue the impossible without faltering. The Lernaean hind and the Stymphalian birds tested his patience and ingenuity, proving that his spirit was as formidable as his body. As he faced Eurystheus once more, the king's jealousy grew, and with it his determination to craft tasks that would not only challenge but humiliate the hero, to tarnish the legend that grew with each victory. King Eurystheus, in his jealousy, assigned Heracles tasks that were not only difficult, but also humiliating, intended to degrade the hero's reputation. The labors thus far, the Nemean Lion, the Lernaean Hydra, The Lernaean hind and the Stymphalian birds had showcased Heracles' divine strength and relentless endurance, but Eurystheus, goaded by Hera's venomous whispers, grew increasingly desperate to diminish the son of Zeus. No longer content with pitting him against monstrous foes or elusive quarry, the king devised a task meant to humble the hero, to strip away the glory that clung to him like the lion's pelt he wore. The fifth labor for Eurystheus had skipped the fourth, perhaps to keep Heracles off balance, was to clean the Augean stables in a single day, a chore so degrading that it seemed beneath a hero of Heracles' stature. The stables, belonging to King Augeas of Elis, housed thousands of divine cattle, their dung piling up over years into a mountain of filth that choked the land and fouled the air. This was no test of strength or courage, but a deliberate insult, a command to wade through muck and shame in full view of the world. Heracles arrived in Elis under a blazing sun, the stench of the stables assaulting his senses long before he saw their sprawling expanse. The cattle gifts from the gods were healthy and numerous, but their pens had not been cleaned in decades, the ground a festering morass that seemed to mock the very idea of heroism. King Augeas, a shrewd and greedy man, smirked as he greeted Heracles, offering a tenth of his cattle if the task could be completed in a day, a wager he believed impossible. The people of Elis gathered, their whispers tinged with pity and derision, expecting to see the great Heracles reduced to a laborer, shoveling filth like a common servant. But Heracles, his mind as sharp as his muscles were strong, saw through the humiliation to the challenge beneath. He did not reach for a shovel or bend his back to the task. Instead, he surveyed the land, his eyes tracing the paths of two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, that flowed nearby, their waters swift and untamed. A plan formed, one that would turn Eurystheus' attempt to degrade him into a triumph of ingenuity. With his club and bare hands, Heracles set to work not in the stables, but on the banks of the rivers. He toiled through the morning, digging channels with a precision that belied the brute force of his frame. The earth yielded to his strength, great mounds of soil piling up as he carved a new course for the rivers. By midday, he had redirected their flow, guiding the rushing waters straight through the heart of the Augean stables. The flood roared in a cleansing tide that swept away years of filth, scouring the pens clean in a matter of hours. The cattle lowed in confusion as the waters surged, but not a single beast was harmed. By dusk, the stables gleamed, the air fresh for the first time in memory. The people of Elis stood in awe, their mockery silenced, as Heracles stood triumphant, his lion-skin cloak untouched by the muck he had conquered. Augeas, however, reneged on his promise of payment, claiming Heracles had cheated by using the river's power. Eurystheus, seizing on this, declared the labor invalid, refusing to count it toward the 12, for Heracles had not toiled as a servant should. Yet the hero's spirit remained unbroken, his cleverness a rebuke to those who sought to shame him. This labor revealed a new dimension of Heracles' heroism, his ability to transform humiliation into victory through intellect and resourcefulness. The Augean stables, meant to tarnish his name instead, became a testament to his adaptability, a story told across Greece of how the son of Zeus turned a king's spite into a feat of legend. Eurystheus, enraged by this success, schemed to push Heracles further, to send him beyond the familiar lands of Greece into realms where myth and reality blurred. The labors to come would take him to distant shores and face him with creatures born of divine whims, each task a step deeper into the cosmic tapestry of his destiny. As Heracles left Elis, his gaze turned outward, ready to confront challenges that would test not just his body and mind, but his place in the world of gods and men. Gradually, the tasks pushed Heracles beyond the boundaries of the mortal world into the lands of myth and warrior women. The labors imposed by King Eurystheus under Hera's vengeful guidance had already tested Heracles' strength, endurance, and ingenuity, but now they drew him into realms where the line between mortal and divine blurred, where legends walked the earth and the impossible became reality. The seventh labor was to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent creature said to be the father of the Minotaur, born from the sea god, Poseidon's wrath and sacred to his divine power. This bull, with its snow-white hide and horns that curved like crescent moons, roamed the island of Crete, its strength so great that it shook the earth with every step, its bellows echoing across the Aegean. Eurystheus, hoping to see Heracles crushed by the beast's might, sent him to Crete, a land steeped in mystery, where King Minos ruled over a labyrinthine palace and a people who revered the divine bull. Heracles set sail, his lion-skin cloak billowing in the sea wind, his heart resolute despite the growing weight of his trials. The journey to Crete was arduous, the sea churning with storms that seemed to carry Poseidon's own displeasure. When Heracles landed on the island's shores, the Cretans greeted him with wary respect, their tales of the bull painting it as a force of nature, untamable and wild. King Minos, eager to be rid of the beast that disrupted his lands, granted Heracles permission to pursue it, though his eyes gleamed with doubt. Heracles tracked the bull across Crete's rugged hills, its hoofprints scarring the earth like the tracks of a goat. When he found it grazing in a sunlit meadow, its beauty was matched only by its ferocity. The bull charged its horns, lowered the ground, trembling beneath its weight. Heracles, unarmed save for his strength, met the charge head-on. He seized the bull by its horns, his muscles straining as he wrestled it to a standstill. The struggle was fierce man against beast, each moment a test of Heracles' divine power. At last he forced the bull to its knees, binding its massive form with ropes and leading it to the shore. Sailing back to Mycenae, he presented the subdued creature to Eurystheus, who, trembling at its might, ordered its sacrifice to Hera, a bitter irony given her hatred for the hero. Yet the labor was counted, and Heracles' legend grew, his name now whispered in lands far beyond Greece. The ninth labor for Eurystheus had again shuffled the order, perhaps to unsettle the hero sent Heracles to the land of the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women who lived on the edge of the known world by the shores of the Black Sea. His task was to retrieve the girdle of Hippolyta, their queen, a belt bestowed by Ares, the god of war, symbolizing her authority and prowess. The Amazons were no ordinary foes. They were daughters of Ares, fierce and fearless, their lives dedicated to battle. Their land was a place of myth, where women ruled with iron and fire, and men were mere shadows. Heracles, accompanied by a band of trusted companions, sailed across treacherous seas, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this labor would demand not just strength, but diplomacy, for the Amazons were as cunning as they were deadly. Upon reaching their shores, he was met with a sight that stirred both awe and caution. Ranks of women, clad in armor, their bows drawn, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Hippolyta, tall and regal, stepped forward, the girdle gleaming at her waist, its leather etched with symbols of war. Heracles, ever respectful of strength, approached her with honesty, explaining his mission and the divine mandate that drove him. Hippolyta, moved by his candor and the tragedy of his past, agreed to give him the gird, pimply admiring the hero who stood before her, not as a conqueror, but as a man bound by fate. But Hera, ever watchful, could not allow such an easy victory. Disguised as an Amazon, she spread whispers of betrayal, claiming Heracles meant to enslave their queen. The Amazons, inflamed by the deception, attacked. The clash was brutal, a storm of arrows and spears against Heracles and his men. With a heavy heart, Heracles fought back, his strength unmatched, but his soul pained by the necessity of violence. In the chaos, Hippolyta fell, her girdle taken not as a gift, but as a spoil of battle. Heracles returned to Mycenae, the belt in hand, but the victory was bittersweet, tainted by bloodshed he had not sought. Eurystheus, pleased by the hero's turmoil, accepted the girdle, his smirk a silent taunt. These labors, set in lands where myth wove itself into reality, marked a turning point in Heracles' journey. The Cretan bull and the girdle of Hippolyta drew him into the divine and the unknown, testing his ability to navigate worlds beyond mortal ken. As he stood before Eurystheus once more, his victories piling like stones in a monument to his redemption, the king's envy only deepened, leading to tasks that would push Heracles to the very edges of the earth and the boundaries of legend. He even had to journey to the very edge of the world to confront creatures that existed only in legend. The labors of Heracles, imposed by the spiteful king Eurystheus under Hera's malevolent guidance, had grown ever more daunting, pulling the hero from the familiar landscapes of Greece into realms where the mortal and divine intertwined in strange and perilous ways. The eighth labor sent him to Thrace to tame the mares of Diomedes, 4 ferocious horses owned by the savage king Diomedes, son of Ares. These were no ordinary steeds. Their eyes blazed with madness, their teeth tore flesh like daggers, and their hunger for human flesh made them a terror to all who neared their stables. Bound with chains of bronze, they snorted fire and stamped hooves that cracked the earth, a fitting challenge for a hero whose strength had already felled lions and hydras. Eurystheus, hoping to see Heracles torn apart by these monstrous beasts, relished the thought of the hero's failure, while Hera watched from Olympus, her heart cold with anticipation. Heracles, cloaked in the lion's pelt, set out for Thrace, his steps heavy with the weight of his past, but driven by the unyielding need to atone. The journey to Thrace was a trial in itself, crossing storm-tossed seas and barren lands, where the wind carried whispers of dread. When Heracles reached the court of Diomedes, he found a kingdom steeped in cruelty, its king as brutal as the horses he kept. Diomedes, a giant of a man, with a heart as dark as his lineage, mocked Heracles, believing no one could master his mares. Undeterred, Heracles approached the stables, the air thick with the stench of blood and the screams of the horses' victims. The mares lunged against their chains, their manes wild, their jaws snapping. Heracles, with his divine strength, tore the bronze chains from their moorings, his hands unyielding as he wrestled the first mare to submission. But the others broke free, their hooves thundering as they charged. A fierce battle ensued, Heracles, grappling each horse with a power that matched their ferocity, his muscles straining as he forced them into submission. Yet Diomedes, enraged by the hero's success, rallied his warriors to attack. In the chaos, Heracles turned the mares upon their master, and the man-eating beasts devoured Diomedes, their hunger sated by the one who had fed them cruelty. With the mares tamed, Heracles drove them to Mycenae, presenting them to Eurystheus, who cowered at their sight, and ordered them dedicated to Hera, another bitter twist in the hero's trials. The 10th labor pushed Heracles even further to the island of Erytheia, at the western edge of the world, where the sun dipped below the horizon and the boundaries of reality frayed. His task was to steal the cattle of Geryon, a monstrous giant, with 3 bodies joined at the waist, each wielding a club, and shield his strength rivaling that of the gods. Geryon's cattle, red as the setting sun, were guarded by the 2-headed dog Orthrus and the herdsman Eurytion, both as fearsome as their master. To reach Erytheia, Heracles crossed the Libyan desert, his path blocked by the searing heat of the sun. In a moment of defiance, he drew his bow against Helios himself, the sun god who, impressed by his audacity, lent him a golden boat to cross the ocean. Landing on Erytheia, Heracles faced Orthrus first, dispatching the beast with a single blow of his club. Eurytion fell next, his spear no match for the hero's might. Geryon, alerted by the commotion, strode forth, his three bodies moving as one, a towering nightmare of power. The battle was fierce, the earth shaking under their clash, but Heracles, armed with his venom-tipped arrows, pierced Geryon's hearts, felling the giant. He drove the cattle across land and sea, facing countless perils, storms, bandits, and Hera's own attempts to scatter the herd. At last he delivered them to Eurystheus, who sacrificed them to Hera, his fear of Heracles growing with each completed labor. These journeys to the edge of the world marked a new chapter in Heracles' saga, where he faced creatures born of myth and divine wrath. The mares of Diomedes and the cattle of Geryon were not mere beasts, but symbols of chaos challenges that tested his ability to bring order to the impossible. Each victory carved his name deeper into the annals of legend, yet Eurystheus' envy and Hera's hatred only intensified, setting the stage for labors that would push Heracles into the realms of gods and the underworld itself. The final two trials were nearly impossible tasks, requiring Heracles to directly confront the gods and the underworld itself. By now, Heracles had journeyed across the known world, slaying monsters, taming beasts, and bending the forces of nature to his will. Yet King Eurystheus, driven by Hera's unrelenting spite, sought to push the hero beyond the limits of mortal endurance. The 11th labor was to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, divine fruits guarded by nymphs, and a dragon in a garden at the edge of the world where the sun met the stars. These apples, gifts from Gaia to Hera at her wedding to Zeus, were sacred, imbued with the essence of immortality, and their theft was a direct challenge to the divine order. Heracles, his lion-skin cloak, weathered from countless trials, set out with a heart both weary and resolute, knowing this task would pit him against forces no mortal had dared to face. The journey was long, crossing deserts and seas, each step taking him further from the mortal realm, into a place where myths breathed and the gods held sway. The location of the Hesperides garden was a mystery hidden even from the wisest of men. Heracles wandered seeking clues, his path guided by whispers of the divine. He first sought out Nereus, the old man of the sea, a shape-shifting god who knew all secrets. Grappling with Nereus as he transformed from man to beast to fire, Heracles held fast, forcing the god to reveal the garden's location. His journey took him through lands of eternal twilight, where the air shimmered with otherworldly light. Along the way, he encountered Prometheus the Titan, chained to a rock for stealing fire for mankind. Moved by pity, Heracles freed him, slaying the eagle that tormented him daily. In gratitude, Prometheus advised Heracles to seek Atlas the Titan, who held the heavens on his shoulders, for the garden lay near his domain. When Heracles found Atlas, his massive form bent under the weight of the sky, he proposed a bargain: he would hold the heavens if Atlas retrieved the apples. Atlas, eager for a moment's respite, agreed, and Heracles shouldered the celestial burden, his muscles straining under a weight that could crush mountains. The sky pressed down a vast and infinite force, yet Heracles endured, his will unyielding. Atlas returned with the golden apples, their radiance like captured sunlight, but he betrayed Heracles, refusing to take back the heavens. Cunningly, Heracles asked Atlas to hold the sky briefly while he adjusted his cloak. When Atlas complied, Heracles seized the apples and departed, leaving the Titan to his eternal task. The Hesperides dragon Laudon had been no match for Atlas, but the theft was a bold affront to Hera, who seethed at the loss of her sacred fruit. Heracles presented the apples to Eurystheus, who, overwhelmed by their divine aura, returned them to Athena, who restored them to the garden. This labor, a triumph of strength, cunning, and endurance, brought Heracles closer to his redemption. Yet one final trial loomed, a task that would take him beyond the mortal world into the realm of death itself. The 11th labor had pushed Heracles to the boundaries of the divine, but it also set the stage for the ultimate test of his heroism. As he stood before Eurystheus, the golden apples a fleeting triumph, the king's fear was palpable, yet his malice remained. The final labor awaited a journey into the underworld, to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of Hades, a task that would demand Heracles confront death itself with nothing but his bare hands. This descent into the realm of shadows would be the pinnacle of his trials, a moment where his mortal and divine natures would collide, forging a legend that would echo through eternity. And the final, most terrifying labor was a journey into hell to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld, using only his bare hands. Heracles had faced monsters, gods, and the edges of the world, but this 12th labor, decreed by the spiteful king Eurystheus under Hera's vengeful influence, was the ultimate test, a descent into the realm of Hades, where no living soul ventured and returned unchanged. Cerberus, the monstrous hound that guarded the gates of the underworld, was a creature of nightmare with 3 snarling heads, each bristling with fangs, a mane of serpents, and a tail that lashed like a scorpion's sting. Its eyes glowed with the cold light of death, and its bark could freeze the blood of the boldest warrior. To capture this beast without weapons, to drag it from the shadows into the light of the living world, was a task that seemed to mock the very notion of heroism. Yet Heracles, his lion-skin cloak weathered by countless trials, his heart scarred by guilt, but burning with resolve, set out for the underworld, knowing this labor would bring him face to face with death itself. The journey began at Taenarum, a desolate cape where a cavern yawned like the mouth of oblivion, said to be a gateway to Hades' realm. Heracles stood at its entrance, the wind howling with the cries of lost souls, and descended into the darkness. The path was treacherous, a labyrinth of stone and shadow, the air heavy with the chill of eternity. As he ventured deeper, the shades of the dead swirled around him, their whispers a haunting chorus of sorrow and regret. Heracles, guided by Hermes and protected by Athena, pressed on his footsteps, echoing in the vast emptiness. He encountered spirits of heroes and sinners alike, their eyes hollow, their voices pleading for release. Among them, he saw Meleager, a friend from his past, and promised to honor his memory, a vow that would shape his later life. The underworld was no place for the living, and its oppressive weight tested even Heracles' indomitable spirit, but his purpose, redemption for the blood of his family, kept him moving forward. At the gates of Hades' palace, Heracles found Cerberus, its 3 heads snarling, its serpentine mane hissing with venom. The beast lunged, its jaws snapping, but Heracles, forbidden from using weapons, relied solely on his divine strength. He seized Cerberus by its necks, his hands gripping the writhing monster as its claws raked his flesh. The struggle was titanic, the ground trembling beneath them, the air filled with the beast's roars and the hissing of its serpents. Heracles, his muscles bulging, his breath ragged, wrestled Cerberus into submission, his arms locking around its throats until the creature's resistance faltered. But capturing the beast was only half the task. He had to bring it to the living world. Dragging the snarling hound through the underworld, Heracles faced the wrath of Hades himself, who appeared before him cloaked in shadow, his eyes cold as the void. With respect and courage, Heracles pleaded his case, explaining his quest for atonement. Hades, moved by the hero's sincerity, permitted him to take Cerberus, provided he could do so without harm, and return the beast unharmed. Heracles emerged from the underworld, Cerberus in tow, its 3 heads growling, but subdued under his iron grip. The sight of the hero, cloaked in the lion's pelt, dragging the monstrous hound into the sunlight, struck awe and terror into all who saw it. In Mycenae, Eurystheus, expecting failure, cowered in a bronze jar at the sight of Cerberus, his courage failing him entirely. He ordered Heracles to return the beast to the underworld, unable to bear its presence. Heracles complied, leading Cerberus back to Hades, his task complete. This labor, more than any other, symbolized Heracles' triumph over death itself, a victory not just of strength, but of will, a testament to his unyielding quest for redemption. With the 12th labor finished, Heracles stood on the cusp of freedom, his soul cleansed through trials that had pushed him to the limits of mortal and divine endurance. The capture of Cerberus was the pinnacle of Heracles' labors, a feat that bridged the worlds of the living and the dead. Yet even as he completed his service to Eurystheus, the shadow of his tragic past lingered, and his journey was far from over. The labors had reshaped him, forging a hero whose name would echo through eternity, but his fate held more trials, more sorrow, and a destiny that would transcend mortality itself. After completing all 12 labors, Heracles was finally free, his soul cleansed through extraordinary suffering and effort. Yet his tragic fate had not yet released its hold on him. The trials imposed by King Eurystheus, slaying the Nemean Lion, battling the Hydra, capturing the Lernaean Hind, driving away the Stymphalian birds, cleaning the Augean stables, taming the Cretan bull, retrieving the girdle of Hippolyta, subduing the mares of Diomedes, stealing the cattle of Geryon, securing the golden apples of the Hesperides, and dragging Cerberus from the underworld, had pushed Heracles beyond the limits of mortal endurance, forging him into a legend that echoed across Greece and beyond. Each labor had been a step toward atonement, a purging of the guilt that clung to him from the madness-induced slaughter of his wife Megara and their children, orchestrated by Hera's unrelenting hatred. When he stood before Eurystheus for the final time, presenting the snarling Cerberus and then returning it to Hades, the king had no choice but to acknowledge the completion of the 12-year sentence decreed by the oracle at Delphi. Heracles, cloaked in the lion's pelt, his body scarred, and his eyes weary but resolute, was released from his servitude, his soul cleansed in the eyes of the gods. Yet the weight of his past and the caprice of fate ensured that his journey was far from its end. Freedom brought Heracles no peace, for the world he returned to was one still shadowed by his tragedy. Thebes, his birthplace, held memories too painful to face, and the whispers of his crime followed him like ghosts. He wandered a hero without a home, seeking purpose in a life that had been defined by divine punishment. His strength, once a gift, now felt like a burden, for what use was power without joy? Yet Heracles was not a man to linger in despair. He sought new challenges, new ways to honor the memory of his lost family, and to prove himself worthy of the redemption he had earned. He joined the Argonauts for a time, sailing with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece, his presence a boon to their quest, until his own path called him elsewhere. He fought in battles, aided kings, and performed deeds that added to his legend, but each victory was tinged with the sorrow of his past, a reminder that no labor could fully erase the blood on his hands. It was during this period that Heracles' life took a new turn, one marked by love and tragedy intertwined. He married Deianira, a woman of beauty and courage whose love offered him a glimpse of the happiness he had lost. Their union was a rare moment of light, and together they had children, a new family that stirred both hope and fear in Heracles' heart. Yet even this happiness was not to last. The centaur Nessus, seeking to avenge an old grudge, tricked Deianira into believing that his blood, poisoned by the Hydra's venom from Heracles' own arrows, was a love charm. In her innocence, Deianira kept the blood unaware of its deadly power. Years later, fearing Heracles' affection for another, she smeared the blood on a cloak and gifted it to him, hoping to secure his love. When Heracles donned the cloak, the poison seared his flesh, a torment so excruciating that even his divine strength could not endure it. The pain was a fire that consumed him, his cries echoing across the land as he tore at the cloak which clung to him like a curse. In his agony, he realized the depth of his tragic fate. Not even his labors could shield him from Hera's reach, or the frailties of mortal love. Heracles, knowing death was near, chose his end with the dignity of a hero. He climbed Mount Oeta, building a pyre of oak and olive, and lay upon it his lion skin cloak draped over him one last time. He called for a torch to be lit, and as the flames rose, they consumed his mortal flesh, a final purification that echoed the trials of his labors. His death was not an end, but a transformation, a release from the mortal coil that had bound him to suffering. Yet even as his body burned, his story was far from finished, for Heracles' destiny stretched beyond the mortal world, into the realm of the gods, where his trials would find their ultimate resolution. The completion of the 12 labors had freed Heracles from Eurystheus' chains, but his tragic death on Mount Oeta revealed that his journey was not merely one of redemption, but of transcendence. As the flames of his pyre rose, they carried him toward a fate that no other hero had achieved, a destiny that would see him rise above the mortal world and claim a place among the immortals. But unlike any other hero, death was not the end for Heracles. As his mortal body was consumed by fire, his divine part ascended to Mount Olympus. The pyre on Mount Oeta blazed under a sky heavy with stars, its flames licking the heavens as they devoured the mortal flesh of the son of Zeus. Heracles, who had endured trials that would have broken any other, lay upon the burning timbers, his lion skin cloak draped over him, a final emblem of the labors that had defined his life. The poison of Nessus, smeared on the cloak by his unwitting wife Deianira, had brought him unimaginable agony, a torment that seared through his divine strength and mortal heart alike. Yet as the fire roared, it was not merely destruction, but transformation, a purification that stripped away the mortal frailties that had bound him to a life of suffering. The flames, bright and relentless, carried his essence upward, a beacon to the gods who watched from their celestial thrones. Heracles, the hero who had wrestled monsters, defied gods, and walked through the gates of death, was no longer a man, but something greater, his divine spark rising to claim its rightful place among the immortals. As the pyre burned, the heavens themselves seemed to acknowledge his ascent. Zeus, his father, looked down with pride, his voice a thunder that rolled across the cosmos, proclaiming Heracles' worthiness. The gods of Olympus, who had once viewed the hero with indifference or scorn, now stood in awe of his deeds. Even Hera, whose hatred had shaped his life with trials and tragedy, could no longer deny his greatness. In a gesture that marked the end of her vendetta, she welcomed him to Olympus, her divine heart softened by the magnitude of his suffering and triumphs. Heracles' ascension was no mere reward. It was the culmination of a journey that had redefined what it meant to be a hero. His labors slaying the Nemean Lion, battling the Hydra, capturing the Lernaean Hind, driving away the Stymphalian birds, cleaning the Augean stables, taming the Cretan bull, retrieving the girdle of Hippolyta, subduing the mares of Diomedes, stealing the cattle of Geryon, securing the golden apples of the Hesperides, and dragging Cerberus from the underworld, had not only cleansed his soul, but elevated him beyond mortality. Each task, each moment of pain and perseverance had forged a path to divinity, a testament to the resilience of a spirit that refused to break. On Olympus, Heracles was transformed, his mortal scars replaced by the radiance of a god. He stood among the divine assembly, his presence commanding, yet humble a figure who had earned his place through deeds no other could match. The gods granted him immortality, his name now etched in the stars, a constellation that would shine for eternity as a reminder of his journey. In a final act of reconciliation, Hera, once his tormentor, gave him her blessing, uniting him in marriage to Hebe, the goddess of youth, whose eternal vitality complemented his hard-won divinity. Their union was a symbol of renewal, a promise that even the most tragic of lives could find harmony in the end. Heracles, now a god, took his place on Olympus, not as a servant, but as an equal, his laughter mingling with that of Zeus and Apollo, his strength a pillar of the divine order. Yet even in his godhood, he remained a symbol of humanity's potential, a hero who had faced the darkest depths of guilt and emerged into the light of redemption. The story of Heracles is not merely one of strength or suffering, but of the human capacity to endure, to atone, and to transcend. His labors, born of Hera's wrath and Eurystheus' envy, were more than trials. They were a crucible that refined his soul, proving that even a man burdened by tragedy could rise to touch the divine. His ascent to Olympus marked him as unique among heroes, the only one to bridge the mortal and immortal through sheer will and sacrifice. Across Greece, his name became a beacon, his deeds recounted in songs and stories, inspiring generations to face their own trials with courage. Heracles, the son of Zeus, the slayer of monsters, the conqueror of death, became a symbol of hope not just for heroes, but for all who strive against impossible odds. His life, marked by pain and triumph, showed that redemption is not a gift, but a journey, one that demands every ounce of strength, heart, and soul. As we reflect on Heracles' saga, we see a man who, through extraordinary suffering, achieved the impossible. His labors, his losses, and his ultimate apotheosis weave a tale that resonates across time, a reminder that even in the face of divine wrath and mortal frailty, the human spirit can soar. Heracles' ascent to Olympus closes his earthly journey, but his legacy endures, a flame that burns as brightly as the pyre that carried him to the gods, illuminating the path for all who dare to dream of immortality. And so, dear friends, we leave Heracles ascending his mortal trials, burned away in the fires of redemption. The labors are done, his soul cleansed, yet his legend shines brighter than ever. Olympus welcomes its newest god, forged in courage and suffering. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If this tale stirred your heart, subscribe and hit the bell. Share your thoughts below, which labor inspired you most. Until next time, let the stars guide your dreams.